Welcome to the Word Unwrapped podcast with
Dr. Gregg Curtis. In this podcast, we take a deeper dive into some of your favorite Bible verses that may require some added context to further explain their intended meaning.
And now here's your host, Dr. Gregg Curtis.
Welcome to our podcast today. Today we're going to be dealing with a very interesting question that a listener has sent to us. We're going to look at it, explore it, and try to answer this perplexing question out of Genesis 6. And today I have with us our assistant, Susannah Sizemore, who's going to be kind of learning as we go on this question. So what's the question?
It is, of course, coming out of Genesis 6 and asking about the giants that the Bible talks about. Yeah,
and that's an interesting topic. You know, the word giants, the Hebrew carries the idea of people not only of big stature, but it also says in the scripture here in verse 4 that they were men of renown. That is, they were very famous. They were able to evidently do things that normal human beings were not able to do. So the Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4 passage has a lot of explanations depending on what school you went to and who your teacher was. The word for giants or mighty men is the word Nephilim. And so this is a race of people that existed prior to the flood and evidently after the flood, because when you look at the scripture here in Genesis 6, it says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterward. So evidently the Nephilim did not go away because of the flood. Even though the flood took care of them in the beginning, there was something afterward that came about. So let's look at that passage a little bit. Let's just read it and see what the scripture says. It says, when mankind began to multiply on the earth, and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they took as they chose as wives for themselves. And the Lord said, my spirit will not always remain with mankind forever, because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterwards, when the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind, who bore children to them. They were the powerful men of old, the famous men, or the men of renown. Well, there's a lot of explanations for the Nephilim. When I was in seminary, I had a professor who said, now what we're dealing with here is the godly line of Seth, that's the sons of God, were marrying the ungodly line of Cain, that was the daughters, okay, the daughters of men, and they made it, and they evidently produced giants. And I was always kind of confused by that. It seemed to me like if the sons of God were nothing more than human men and the daughters of Cain were nothing more than human daughters, how did this union produce giants? How did this union produce these mighty men of old? You know, I could never put the two together. And the other explanations that have come along, and some of this comes from the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch actually goes into great detail explaining this, is that what is said here is that the sons of God were actually fallen angels. And we know that the angels fell, and the fallen angels are outnumbered by the good angels in a 2-to-1 ratio. These fallen angels came to earth, and they had the ability to procreate with these women. Now the question is, why in the world would that happen? Why would they even want to? Well, the answer to that seems to be that Satan, who understood the Genesis 3:15, where it was said that from the seed of woman would come the very one who would crush his head, he wanted to stop that. He did not want the seed of the woman to destroy him. So he came up with a plan to mongrelize the DNA of humanity to where the Messiah would not be able to be born. The seed that would defeat him could be born into the human family with pure DNA. In other words, the Messiah would not be able to be identified with mankind, which is why he came, why he died, and he rescued mankind. So Satan's idea was, let's mix up, mongrelize the human race, and so the Messiah could not be born.
Which obviously did not happen.
It did not happen.
But it was his plan.
It was his plan, and evidently he attempted it. Now, some people will object and say, no, wait a minute, how can fallen angels, how can they mate with human women? Is it even physiological possible? We don't know enough about fallen angels to understand how they were able to do this. Whether it was their own DNA or whether they manipulated DNA to create this race. But the race was there. Now some people say, well, these giants were always on the earth. Well, no, it doesn't say Adam and Eve were giants. So to say this race of giants was always on the earth prior to the flood, where did they come from? Or that they were on the earth after the flood, where did they come from?
Because this is the first mention in Genesis 6.
First mentioned of the giants, in Genesis 6. So there are a lot of unanswered questions, and of course, as I said, we go to the book of Enoch, which tells us about how the fallen angels planned this and how that they were trying to again stop the Messiah from being born into the human race. And of course, we don't want to take our theology from a non-canonical book like Enoch, but Enoch was widely regarded as a legitimate scripture by the early church. Even if you go today to the Ethiopian Bible, you will find Enoch as a part of that. So while we do not recognize it as a canonical book, it still has historical value because it was pretty much written down the oral tradition of what this means. So evidently what we've got here is Peter talks about this, Jude talks about this, and they talk about how that God punished these fallen ones, these watchers as Enoch calls them, and punished them and binding them in chains of darkness, waiting for the day of judgment for what they did in their attempt to do this. Well, somebody says, well, then it says in the scripture that afterwards, after the flood, there were still giants. We got Goliath, who was a giant. The sons of Anak, that was a whole race of giants. Where did they come from? Well, it could be that Satan thought, okay, maybe I didn't succeed the first round, but I'm going to try this again, and I'm going to do it differently this time. But the end result was still the same. So, as a result of that, we find that when we come into the promised land, the children of Israel, God says destroy them all. And of course, that really creates a problem for a lot of people. How can God say just go in and kill them all? Isn't that genocide? Well, you have to realize if these are a mongrel race, these are a people who do not have a soul. They were not created by God in His image. So what are we dealing with? We're dealing with a group of people who are enemies.
Evil.
Evil.
Yes.
Everything about them is evil. And they are not human beings as you and I think of human beings. So God says destroy them. We are not having this again. This is not going to happen. Of course, and then there are other people who say, well, is there any descendants still among us today? And of course, that's a whole different can of worms for speculation. And some people are also saying, well, then when they died, when these giants died, what happened to their spirit, you know? And some people speculate that the spirits of the dead Nephilim are what we call demons today. So again, there are many questions and speculations, and we have to be careful that we stick just with Scripture. And what Scripture tells us, they existed, that the angels had something, the fallen angels had something to do with this. The result was that they were trying to stop the Genesis 3:15 curse on them and keep the Messiah from being born. It didn't work. It hasn't. It won't. Messiah came, and today we have the victory of Christ and His death, burial, and resurrection. So Satan never quits trying. He still thinks he can win.
Thank you for being a part of the Word Unwrapped podcast with Dr. Gregg Curtis. In this podcast, we take a deeper dive into some of your favorite Bible verses that may require some added context to further explain their intended meaning. If you have a question or would like to suggest a topic idea for discussion, email us at thewordunwrapped@gmail.com, and we may use your question in a future episode. If you enjoyed today's program, please click the subscribe button, and we'll notify you when new episodes become available. And remember to click the share button if you'd like to send this podcast to family and friends.